both, Sir Bernard.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome into the Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-hosting with Peter Bale in Hoon Bay. Peter, how are you?
Hi, Bernard. I'm good, thank you. I think I can just about feel your toe tapping the rhythm so that you know when to come in and say kia koto, tēnā koutou katoa. You're in Wellington yet again, doing something that about well-being, I believe, right? Not your own well-being, about economic well-being. Is that correct?
Not my own well-being, no. I've just spoken at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance about the Kaka project, and also hosted a discussion about the future economy. So that was sort of fun, and we got to talk the talk. I'm not sure we've solved all the world's problems, but we had a good chat about it at least. And I'm coming home though. I'm really looking forward to coming home.
Good. What, to my house? Are you coming to my? You and Lynn are most welcome to come and stay. Well, you are. I mean, Lynn can stay on the sofa, but yeah, yep. If anything goes wrong, you can always come here rather than go home to the island.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. Yeah. So we'll be jumping on a plane later on, which means that unfortunately.
Yes, tell the audience what we're doing tonight.
Yeah, so this is a bit unusual. I'm going to be staying for about 10 minutes and then handing over to Peter to do the international part of the show with Robert Patman and with Peter. Who have you got coming on the show as well?
Well, yeah, so Robert and I will be talking about international affairs. I think we want to talk quite a lot about Netanyahu. We want to talk about Lebanon. We want to talk about Joe Biden. And I think we probably want to touch on Aukus, given the Japanese ambassador's comments this week and the rather sort of hedgy bits this morning, I thought, listening to Judith Collins talk about that. So we'll touch on some semi-domestic New Zealand issues as well and hopefully bring it home. And of course, to the people watching it currently on YouTube, if you flick a question into YouTube, I will try to get an answer out of Robert, but it'll be Robert and me. And then at the bottom of the hour, at 30 minutes past or so, we will have a interesting chap called Scott Hamilton, who is an historian, coming in. You'll remember some weeks ago I asked Vincent O'Malley to come in to talk to us about the Treaty Principles Bill. And one of the reasons I want Scott to come in is I follow him. Must admit I haven't read either of his books, but I will talk about that when he comes in. It's about the kind of myths that get dredged up. The moment we start as Pākehā, or as a Pākehā-dominant country, as it were, we start talking about human rights and Maori justice, various myths from the past, and even from our own education in the past, come up. And so I want to get Scott to talk a little bit about that. And then Bernard, you're going to look at community housing.
Yes, so the final
when you come back.
Yeah, the final 10-15 minutes of the show I'll be able to come back and we'll speak to Paul Gilbert, who is the CEO of Community Housing Aotearoa. It's been a big week for the community housing sector. We call them the CHIPs because there's been a speech from Chris Bishop, about how the government's going to provide some subsidies and capital support. And the sector itself is pushing ahead with plans to borrow money from pension funds through bonds guaranteed by rich individuals, including the Tyndalls. And we'll talk about the idea of having a government guarantee for these bonds, which is something used widely overseas. So we'll talk about that and housing, because it's always about housing.
Well, it is always about housing with you, Bernard, and I know. I mean, I was thinking about that in my own little house today, and I had the meeting of my body corporate for my building, and essentially it was, do we give over half the building to poor people? No, and the answer was almost certainly not. But housing is such a big issue at the moment, Bernard, and I wish you and I were able to do a really big takeout on Kaigora. and
Yeah,
this
there's
and this
certainly.
issue. We almost need a sort of Paddy Gower. I mean, I don't know. Do we need to do Paddy Gower type news where we say this is all about the fucking housing or what?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that every time, every day, and but we need to do some proper digging into what's actually going on there. We're starting to get a sense now of just how much the momentum of the whole housing sector was connected to
Yes,
Kaingaroa's momentum.
partly because they didn't build, they didn't do the building, and I think people forget about it. I don't think it's been very well explained. I think I told you too, Bernard, this what I heard recently, which I'm just going to put out there to our lovely audience, which is the idea that Kaingaroa would sell some of its rather impressive real estate in Orake to normal developers, i.e., for the kinds of houses that are on Paratai Drive and so on, and generally in Orake, and move that money to develop houses in South Auckland.
That's
And that seems to
politically,
me to be a really good form of political apartheid.
yes, I mean, it would be absolutely politically explosive. I mean, this is the place that the Bastion Point protests
Yes.
were
Yep.
at, and this was what it was about. So if that was going to go down, if you think the Hikoi was a big deal, just wait, because that would be absolutely explosive.
Yeah, but I haven't seen it written, Bernard. Or I think you're. Somebody told me the other day, who the hell, that they were at the Hikoi. Sorry, they went to had to go to Parliament immediately after the Hikoi, and not only was that thing about the one arrest, but there wasn't apparently a blade of grass disturbed or a piece of
Yeah.
litter.
I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Being in Wellington for the last week,
Hmm.
it's all everyone is talking about, the sense of joy, actually, that there are a whole bunch of other people who think the same, who were together, and that they were able to protest in such a direct, clear, often entertaining.
Hmm.
Some of those signs were fantastic way, and that it brought in a lot of support from non-Māori communities. So, and
Yes. No, I
young
thought so
and
too.
old,
And
and
I
you
don't
don't
mind if
get
there's guilt involved. Yeah.
yeah, you don't get 50,000 people marching, the biggest protest march in our history, without a very broad cross section of support. And I
Hmm.
think that's surprised the government a bit and has amplified some of the voices within the National Party who are saying, why have we let ACT dominate the first year of our government
Yep.
and to co-opt our agenda with this thing, which is so against what the National Party for the last 30 years has been about in this
Hmm.
area. And Toitu Te Tiriti is a thing that a lot of people can believe in. There may be 10 or 15% who are hardcore against it, but you've got to be careful that you don't alienate the middle if you're the National Party.
Hmm.
And there is a danger that they're doing that. And I think there's a few people inside the party, in the centre of the party from the old National Party, who are very upset about this because it really goes to something quite emotional for a lot of people. It's about where they're from, who they are, how, how we've achieved a lot, connected with large parts of our country, and
Yeah.
he's wrecking it.
Yeah.
So that's my bit on the
Yeah, it's
treaty.
it's well, that's kind of what I want to want Scott, the historian, Scott Hamilton, the historian, to talk about at the half past the hour is really these issues of how we have these conversations, because I would like to think that you're correct, that there is a huge body of opinion that in fact understands how important this is. We've talked before. I think the Labour Party did a very poor job in the last government, or the Labour government, in explaining the direction we were on. But so previously did Bolger and so on. And as we had last week, I thought it was fascinating. Helen Clark. I'm sorry, not Helen Baby. Helen Clark, or poor old Helen, as my friend Robert is concerned that I call her sometimes. That Helen said she would have done the foreshore and seabed differently.
Yeah, I mean, it was I think, a much more difficult time, and I think you're right that the chunk of the population who wouldn't have a bar of this treaty stuff was bigger in 2003. And I would say to the National Party and ACT that this is a different country now. This is 21 years on.
Yeah.
Since then, we've had we've had all black captains speaking in Te Reo. We've
Yeah.
had our national anthem sung in both languages. We've had a whole generation of people going through kohanga reo.
Well, as you said, Bernard, this is who we are today.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Anyway.
you're a bloody poet, really.
Yeah. So it's a big deal, I think, as is the media landscape at the moment, Peter.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're a big connect of the spin-off people, and I did used to write up for about 3 years, actually, a weekly column for them about or newsletter for them about international affairs. They fired a few people this week and said, "Would you please swing in behind us?" Which New Zealand Geographic did a couple of weeks ago, the same sort of thing. And having never even picked up a copy of New Zealand Geographic, I, sent them some money and signed up.
They are a great publication, by the way.
Yeah.
The most gorgeous, glossy, amazing pictures and stories. It's fantastic.
So tell us what's happening with the spin-off and why that matters.
Yeah, so I have a connection with the spin-off, obviously, in that it's the team that I put out the podcast When the Facts Change, a weekly podcast about the political economy. I record in that area, and they are one of the great success stories of the last decade in producing independent, fascinating, often news-breaking pieces that speak in a different way to a different group. And, in terms of, we've had some sad contractions in the media. We've had, obviously, News Hub fall over, go away, Sunday, Fair go. We've had newspapers close up and down the country, consolidation, NZME announcing the closure of 14 community newspapers. But there has been some good things over the last decade. Obviously, the spin-off, Newsroom, Interest.co.nz, Business Desk. There's a bunch of them where new organisations have set up, new people have done the work that others have stopped doing in traditional media. The trouble is the scale of this downturn in advertising, and also the recession. It's gone on for 2 years.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, I have just been through all my subscriptions. I'm pruning them, and then I also wonder whether there is an argument that we're still not necessarily hitting the audience. I mean, we've got people on here now who are listening to us. I mean, they're listening to you. They care about you. But are these outlets actually addressing an audience and satisfying an audience?
Yeah, well, I know the numbers from the spin-off, 400,000 people a month. I know the numbers from Interest, over 500,000.
Yep.
I know the numbers from Newsroom, well over 500,000. So we're talking collectively at least 1 million New Zealanders who regularly engage with these new organisations, let alone TVNZ, these newspapers. It is a big deal, and I recommend people support spin-off, and I appreciate the support that they give to the kaka, and I welcome any attention on this issue, because we're at an existential level for some news organisations. We've been there, and it's better to know about this before than after, which was the case with News Hub.
Yeah, well, I've almost decided to give up on news myself, Bernard, and I've decided only to read fiction now.
Yeah. Anyway,
Bernard, you're needing to go because lovely Robert is here. Thank God. Nice
Hi,
segue
Robert.
between the two of you.
I'm going to hand over to you two now and come back about 5:45. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Bernard.
Cheers.
Professor Patman, which is one of the most respectable ways I've described you lately. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Peter. How are you?
Good. I'm all right. I mean, although somebody's just telling me, one of our audience actually, that the Hoon has won the Silver Award for the best current affairs podcast. in New Zealand. I've got to dig it up. I think possibly Artie Farty 87 might be misleading me, but I think you would be a huge part of that, Professor Patman, and we're very grateful
thank
for
you.
your taking part. Now, international affairs, you and I have got to wing it. I mean, we could, as I think we know, you and I could do the Joe Rogan 3 hours talking bollocks if we wanted to. I wanted to ask you first about this slightly odd but important Lebanese ceasefire, which is, of course, a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel rather than between Israel and the Lebanese government, since Israel effectively invaded Lebanon, a sovereign country just to its
And
north.
Lebanon's an ally, technically an ally of the United
Technically an
States.
ally, yeah. What the hell is going on here? And do you want to talk about what the implications of that might be?
It seems like a pretty fragile ceasefire at the moment. It's held to date, we understand. But I was rather interested in Mr. Netanyahu's presentation or his justification for doing this. And he said that he felt they were now in a position to move those Israeli citizens back to the border with Lebanon. But he had earlier said that when he launched the invasion on the 1st of October, he had said that the objective was to destroy Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And yet, just a day before or 2 days before the decision that the ceasefire was in the works, we heard that Hezbollah had launched something like 300 rockets. So there's no doubt about it. Hezbollah have been seriously degraded. They haven't been eliminated, however. And so, in a sense, I think Mr. Netanyahu is acknowledging, first of all, the pressure on the Israeli army. And secondly, it's clear that his far-right coalition government have quite ambitious objectives in the West Bank, which they want to...
You mean Judea and Samaria, as we're going to be calling it soon?
Yes.
Possibly not us, but yeah.
Well, that remains to be seen. I mean, that's also incumbent on a number of other Western liberal democracies to make clear if they do stand for a two-state solution, and our government does, then it's not time for them to speak up and warn the United States they don't want any backtracking by Mr. Trump on that long-held objective. But we'll hold our breath on that one, shall we?
Yeah, on the one with Lebanon, you remember Hala Jabba, who you met some weeks ago. I've been trying to get Hala on, but she doesn't want to do it at 6 a.m. her time, which is perfectly fair enough.
Sure.
So I was going to pre-record one, but I had been talking to Hala and following her, and she is still in the middle of Beirut, and she just every night tweets that things are getting worse and worse and worse, and that buildings closer and closer and closer to her are being destroyed. Hopefully that has now stopped and she'll come in. But, this is the most extraordinary intervention by Israel, if you can call it that. I mean, they've gone up to Tyre. They've attacked... I think the IDF posted this week that they had destroyed a Hezbollah missile base on the Syrian border, which, of course, in a sense is entirely legitimate. But the suburbs of Beirut are a whole different subject, aren't they? A whole different kettle of fish, as it were.
Yeah. I'm not sure how legitimate it is to destroy Hezbollah's missile base. It's a Lebanese organisation. It's part of Lebanon, and they certainly they certainly use terror, and they probably have outside support from, amongst others, Iran.
Yeah.
Probably Iran is its principal supporter. Whether that justifies breaking international law and violating the territorial integrity of Lebanon and its sovereignty, and apparently without any rebuke from the United States, it remains to be seen. I think we're going to be living, Peter, with the consequences of what's happened both in Gaza and Lebanon for a long time.
Yes, I was
wondering.
And
I don't think the United States is going to... I do not think its soft power has been boosted by its participation in these events. Its complicity.
And I wondered, Robert, I could almost write what you might say, I think, in a way, but I suspect I would agree. The wriggling that we're seeing now from I think it's 124 countries have signed up to the ICC. The US, of course, is not part of the International Criminal Court. Loyal listeners will know we had the women from the Asymmetrical Haircuts podcast on recently. We'll get them on again. Netanyahu and Gallant and probably the deceased member of military commander of Hamas have been charged now, and yet you're seeing Hungary, France find wriggle room to say, oh, we'll still engage with Netanyahu and he can probably fly in still because he's got diplomatic immunity. This is a pretty remarkable thing. I mean, it's not the genocide case, but it is. He's being charged with using the weapon of starvation.
Yes.
Against the people of Gaza. Not yet.
Yeah, which
not
is a
yet
war crime.
Genocide. Yeah, which is a war crime. So he's been charged with war crimes. The US, of course, is not a member of the ICC and supports Israel up to the hilt. What does this mean for us? For the rules-based order?
I think the United States, I know it feels absolutely obliged to support Israel come what may, but my argument is if you're a global superpower, you can't be acting like a partisan, ambitious rising power. And the United States has much wider interest than that of Israel. Unfortunately, I think what the United States, by being party to these actions, has, and indeed the Washington Post editorial, Peter, you probably saw it, was an extraordinary attack, and it was a dishonest one on the ICC, in which they said that the ICC wasn't the place to hold Mr. Netanyahu to account.
It's absolutely the place to hold anybody to account, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That was what is designed. It's the court of last resort. It expects member states, and I know that the United States hasn't signed up. The United States, in a sense, has become even more of an outlier. It wants to be the number one state in the world, but it's not prepared to walk the talk when it comes to complying with institutions which it expects others to respect. And this is going to, unfortunately, I think it's going to extract quite a big price for the United States going forward. I mean, let's be quite clear. In the last 12 months, America has diminished its ability to hold any authoritarian country to account in the world. I know this process has been going on for a long time. You could say in the post 9/11 period, with the starting off with the illegal invasion of Iraq, we've been going down this slippery slope. But these events show that Mr. Biden hadn't learned from the lessons of 9/11 when he lectured Mr. Netanyahu on that prospect.
Exactly.
So that's interesting.
Since Bernard's not here, we can just blower on for as long as we like, Robert. But
we should imagine what Bernard would be asking us.
He will. I have to ask the Bernard question at the end, which is about the Chinese ambassador and Aukus, which we will in a second. But when you look at what's going on right now, do you have to recalibrate your work and how you're explaining to your students the behavior of international affairs? I mean, we've seen Trump this week, who's not even the president yet, although it's quite extraordinary the extent to which he is acting as though he were the president by effectively threatening tariffs on Mexico and Canada, breaking a treaty, of course.
Hasn't impressed the Mexican president, though.
No, he hasn't. But she's got some dodgy elements as well, which you can get into. But are you having to sort of recalibrate what's real?
No, because I think what we're witnessing has been what I call the post 9/11 relative decline of the United States.
Yeah.
And that may have been inevitable with the rise of China as a second superpower. But I think also America has continued to, as one American commentator, this country is its own worst enemy. There's been a whole series of unforced errors in its diplomacy. And we've discussed this before, so I won't labour the point, but if you just take its immediate response to Gaza, there is a way in which American domestic politics is actually getting in the way of having a credible foreign policy. And Joe Biden, when confronted with the Gaza, the terror atrocity committed by Hamas in Israel, went in boots and all. Whereas, in fact, as a superpower, particularly one, according to Mr. Biden, he said when he came to the White House that he wanted to resurrect the rules-based order. He forgot all about that. And unfortunately, we've seen that order seriously eroded further. It's not just down to the United States. China's been playing a role out, and so has Russia. But as a liberal democracy, one expects a bit more from the United States, particularly since it's helped establish so many of these institutions.
Well, this is the as Edward Luce from the Financial Times describes today, and I wish I could share my subscription with you all. But this is the world that the United States created, that Roosevelt created in 1947. Really, I mean, of course he died before 1947, but the United Nations was their creation, built on Roosevelt's five freedoms. What about you, Robert? What are you doing? Are you doing lectures at the moment with your students, and what are they asking you?
No, I finished teaching for the semester until next year. I'm writing a book called Rethinking the Global Impact of 9/11. And I always felt, and funny enough, I was going back, because this book has been written over a long period, but I went back to the chapter immediately after 9/11. And unfortunately, I felt at the time, and I wrote about it in the media and various other things, there was a huge omission by the United States immediately after 9/11 for Mr. Bush not to back up his rhetoric. He said immediately after 9/11, or 2 weeks after, it's important we create a Palestinian state to shrink the ring space for extremists in the Middle East. Unfortunately, bureaucratic politics got in the way of that, not least Mr. Rumsfeld and Mr. Cheney, who regarded the then Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat as a gangster, and Mr. Powell and Mr. Bush, who initially favoured a Palestinian state. Mr. Bush, who wasn't the strongest president, came down in favour of having encouraged Mr. Powell to pursue that idea, then came down in favour of Cheney and Rumsfeld, and abandoned Powell.
And of course, if we take it as what's going on at the moment, there is an argument, of course, that Trump, if he has a view about this, is against forever wars, and Cheney and Rumsfeld were the forever war guys. They went to war in an unjust and illegal war.
I don't think, this forever wars thing is much overplayed. I think America continues to have with one exception recently, and that's probably President Obama. I think many American presidents in the post-Cold War period have overestimated America's ability to convert its power into influence, and B, put too much faith that military power can do the heavy lifting for them. And that's just not been true.
No.
In fact, this is one thing I do tell my students, and it's often not commented on in scholarship or the media, and that is, it's very difficult to find any example of a successful unilateral action by a great power in the post-Cold War period. You look at, there's plenty of examples of unilateral action. We saw Iraq, we saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw China claim 90% of the South China Sea.
But
in
all
those
but
cases,
there wasn't military intervention as such.
No, it wasn't military intervention, but they built artificial islands there.
Yes.
It was a unilateral action. That's what I'm trying to say. And in each case,
Tony Blair would say, of course, that the invasion of that his intervention in Sierra Leone was, a masterful example of diplomacy / intelligence / caring about smaller countries. And he would probably also say the same about about Kosovo, with him and
the NATO's humanitarian intervention in Kosovo. Look, I'm not saying there was no successes, but relatively speaking, Peter, if you and I, when we look through the news, and most of our listeners and viewers have the same experience on the day, you would think that great powers run the world. After all, they can block actions, but in fact, they don't.
Yeah, events run the
world. At some point, the world has to come to terms with this, because we have this fantasy that Mr. Trump loves to fuel it. Vote for me, I'll fix it. He won't.
Everything.
He can't fix most of the problems he faces, and in fact, he's going to do some incredible U-turns in the not too distant future. If in the White House, that's what I think, because unfortunately, he's going to be coping with problems that A, he denies exist, such as climate change, and B, I think he has a lot of faith in the art of the big deal.
And
You know,
his ability to negotiate anything.
This Ukraine's going to be an example. And by the way, I noticed that the Zelensky people seem to be, how should I put it, looking at what the North Koreans did with Trump to woo him over, and they seem to be flattering Mr. Trump quite considerably at the moment. So it's a very interesting situation, that one. But yeah, if Mr. Trump believes he can seriously get peace in 24 hours in Ukraine, well, he'll probably find out otherwise.
Well, good. You've just done the segue then. So let's look at Ukraine. You sent me a note today about the ruble.
Yeah.
You know, is Putin in trouble, or is Putin on the ascendant?
Well, there was a very
now?
interesting piece, Peter, in the National Interest. It was a very good piece by someone called Frederick Kelly, and he made the very good point that many people are overlooking the domestic factor when they assess Russia's attempted annexation of Ukraine. And the fact of the matter is that the Russian economy is showing real signs of strain. Alarmingly so, actually, because ruble is now 113 to the dollar, and it devalued by 7% in the last 24 hours. You've got interest rates now at 21%. You've got the head of the central Russian bank openly saying in the Russian media that they say the economy seems to be in free fall, and she's fearing for her life. And then you've got inflation, 9%. So can Mr. And they're burning through their reserves rapidly. This is an expensive business.
Yeah.
So we can't necessarily assume that the Russian economy, it's been more resilient than many people expected. But what seems to have really accentuated the most recent Russian economic problems has been the US Treasury decision to sanction Gazprom Bank, as well as a number of other Russian institutions. So this is a situation we shouldn't lose sight of. The old saying is, I think it was a historian once said that, you know, basically you have words to the effect that you have to feed an army to keep it going. Well,
it's all about your supply lines
to Russia.
Yeah, it's so thinking about what you said about Palestine before, and I'm going to make a little segue to that.
Sure.
You will have seen today, I think possibly I sent it to you, in fact, was the decision today by Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, to at least nominate a successor, I think, which is 13 years after Mahmoud Abbas was elected as president. Is this part of gearing us all up?
And he's avoided election for a long time.
Exactly. Yeah. Is this part of gearing us up for some sort of redrawing of the Palestinian Authority to make this work?
Possibly. He's probably been under pressure to do something like this for some time. Of course, there is a charismatic Palestinian leader who's detained in an Israeli prison.
Barghouti.
Is it Marwan Barghouti?
Yeah.
He's the one the Palestinians would like to see released. In fact, I think Hamas tried to get him released with their demands for a prisoner exchange, but that's unlikely to happen. But yeah, I mean, the terrible thing is that the person that Mahmoud Abbas has nominated as his successor seems to be about as popular as Abbas himself, and doesn't seem to have a lot of weight. In fact, he was amongst Palestinians, he's widely regarded as corrupt. So I think they're moving the furniture, but I'm not sure it's going to be credible.
No, it's a very difficult situation. I mean, and of course, Israel has very cunningly and intelligently done that, to split the Palestinian Authority from Hamas and play them off against each other to the situation we're in now. What are you thinking about this from a New Zealand perspective? I mean, we haven't, we've got. I mean, what do you think about where New Zealand stands diplomatically with Israel? I mean, we are a signatory to the ICC.
Yeah. And we also voted in the General Assembly to support the ICJ finding that the Israeli occupation of the occupation of the Palestinian territories, including the West Bank, is unlawful. So, given that position, New Zealand, in terms of its UN diplomacy, I think has been pretty sound. But there is a case for New Zealand, its public diplomacy, becoming a little bit more energetic. And I think many people now, given the fact that Mr. Netanyahu and his far-right ministers have made it quite plain they want to annex. In fact, they've said they have formally committed themselves to annexing the West Bank.
Yes.
In early 2025. Now, this is a time for Mr. Luxon and Mr. Peters to say that is what Israel is proposing is illegal, and New Zealand can't, support it. And I think New Zealand shouldn't say that on its own. I think it should get together with Canada and Australia. They make joint statements. They've made two joint statements so far on the situation in Gaza. I think it's time for a third one. They should make quite clear and send a message to Washington that they expect the United States to adhere to its stated position.
But do you think as Christopher Luxon would say, do you think the reality is that they're actually waiting to see just how shitty that might be in terms of a reaction from the US? That it isn't the time. I mean, while it might seem
this is a
admirable
question of
to
being a
give the
good ally.
signal.
Are you a good ally by always keeping your head down and saying yes, boss? Really? Because you're complicit in the disastrous outcome. I mean, the idea that Israel can successfully annex the West Bank, first of all, we're against, I think anybody who takes international law seriously would be against it in principle. But let's be quite clear about this. Mr. Netanyahu said he was going to eliminate Hamas. He hasn't. Will he annex the West Bank? Well, he will, but that means he'll have one state with a large Palestinian. He'll have a greater Israel with a large Palestinian population within it, which sounds like a recipe for permanent insurgency.
Yes.
So good luck with that. At the end of the day, Mr. Netanyahu is bending himself out of shape, trying to avoid the obvious issue, which is how can he improve Israel's security and at the same time, and most crucially, address the issue of political self-determination for the Palestinians. He's ruled out the latter.
Yeah.
And he's unlikely to achieve the former.
Yeah, well, I think that what would appear to be happening is that Netanyahu is in fact thinking about his own personal security as opposed to the security of the nation just at the moment. I mean,
you mean from the ICC?
Well, from the ICC, there's
he doesn't seem to be too worried about that. I mean, he can go to the United States and
but there's
France
there's also
seems
the
to
domestic
be rowing back a bit on it now.
Yeah, but there's the domestic prosecutions that he faces. Amongst
he obviously needs to stay in power, which may be why he has to keep coming up with new projects.
Yeah, you mean new wars, new conflicts?
You said that, not me.
New projects. He's going to build a bridge.
Situations which
could be destroying bridges, not building them. I think is the.
Yeah, I mean, that's a cynical view on my part, but he is clearly not keen on returning or the prospect of Israel being secure and in a peaceful situation, because it might raise some very embarrassing questions about his past political record. Yes.
So speaking of embarrassing questions, so Bernard's sitting in the bus on the way to the. I mean, I always think of Bernard in a black, huge Uber executive SUV limousine. But Bernard would think it remiss of me if I didn't ask you about. And yes, we are blaring because we're trying to get Scott on. It's coming a bit difficult. So thank you, Robert, for helping us blar. The Chinese ambassador gave a very good interview, I thought, with Guy Espiner.
Yeah.
He's very clever at this, and it's great to see RNZ's new $22 million being spent on that kind of in-depth reporting.
Whether the government will thank them for it,
that's right.
Remains to be seen.
God, Robert, you should be a media critic as well. You are a media critic, but what do you take from that? And I thought also Judith Collins today was rather. Shifty is the wrong word, but rather discreet, or trying to be discreet about the implications of AUKUS and where it's going.
First of all, I think the Chinese ambassador addressed head-on the optimism which has been presented by Mr. Luxon and Todd McClay, the trade minister, both of whom being publicly quoted as saying, if we decide to join Pillar 2, and they keep saying we haven't made a decision yet, but if we did decide, we are sure that our Chinese friends, that they could accommodate that, or words to that effect. And I think what he was basically saying is actually, and he's addressing obviously a lot of farmers in New Zealand, this is going to be a real problem. And there will be consequences. And who's going to bear those consequences? Well, the farming community, who sends a lot of exports to China. It's our biggest market. And of course, there is another problem looming in the background, which the Chinese ambassador didn't directly allude to, but I thought it came out of the conversation a little bit. And that is, he was presenting China as upholding free trade and contrasting China's position with the incoming populist Trump administration, which unfortunately might saddle New Zealand exporters with 10% tariffs to pay.
Exactly. I mean,
so I do think Trump's arrival has complicated Aukus for the government. On the Judith Collins thing, I found it interesting that she addressed a group of companies in the high-tech sector and said that, they better prepare for this dire international situation, which is getting worse by the day. Whereas, in fact, you could argue that the two countries which are contributing to that is both India and China, which are key supporters of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So the logic is, and James Hunter pointed this out today, rather than tell our companies they should step up, in fact, the government should step up its support for Zelensky's attempt to resist an illegal invasion.
Yeah. There's a lot of twisting going on, Robert. Somebody taught me years ago how to do the twist, and they said, I won't demonstrate it now, but I'll explain it. She said, it's like you're drying your ass with a towel, and if you do that, you can twist. Thank you very much, Robert. And
You're
this
welcome.
is my perfect segue to Paul Gilbert from who's going to talk about housing with Bernard, which means we probably will do 3 hours. Robert, thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks,
Paul, lovely to see you, and I hope you can hear me there.
Perfect, Bernard. You're keeping it real on public transport, I see.
Exactly. Luckily, it's an electric bus, so it's quite quiet. It's very good. Thank you very much. And lovely to see you again. I saw you on Monday night at the launch of the Community Housing Funding Agency. And no doubt you attended the Community Housing Aotearoa conference this week in Auckland, which was very well attended. Made the news, of course, with speeches from Chris Bishop and Ama Potaka, the Housing and Associate Housing Minister, respectively. So a big news week for community housing sector. Firstly, the speech from Chris Bishop, which made a few announcements, but there were a few things that weren't announced. What was your view of that speech from Chris Bishop?
Well, look, thanks for having us on the Hoon. It's been a big week, as you say, between Auckland and Wellington, and plenty of announcements. And first of all, I'd like to say it's been a real pleasure to see the community housing sector in the media, because still not a day goes by where I don't meet somebody who has no idea that we even have a community housing sector in New Zealand, especially not what we do. So I might begin there, because there's now 26,000 houses across the country managed or owned by the community housing sector. And we were thrilled to have Chris Bishop and on day one at our conference come and give some announcements, and then on day two, Minister Potaka. I think in response to your question, the first thing I'd say is we are thrilled that Minister Bishop said that finance is essential. And he said that loud and proud. He also he's made some significant announcements to enhance the credit the arrangements behind the scenes, and has sent a clear signal also to the Reserve Bank around prudentials and risk weightings that are attributed to the work that we do in the community housing sector. Now, all of those things fit within a broader piece of work that the ministers are doing, and that includes Minister Willis, to do what they're calling is levelling the playing field, because traditionally our housing sector has been deeply troubled by the fact that any housing development over 4 or 5 houses is treated as a commercial high risk development by the banks, and has a very, very disproportionate and unrealistic risk weighting attached to it, because it's treated like any speculative residential property development rather than the super, super low risk activity it actually is. And I'll help your listeners to understand what I mean. There is a de facto guarantee in place when a community housing provider signs a contract through the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development to deliver new housing supply. So effectively, there is already a government guarantee in place, because they're committing to pay the full market rent for 25 years. And so we're thrilled that they are codifying that guarantee in effect, and considering what that might look like. And we're super excited that they are seeming to head in the direction of codifying that guarantee. We're not quite there yet, but we're super optimistic, and we're thrilled that they came to the conference. They've made some improvements, and with the announcements that Bishop made in particular, they are clearly helping us to make the boat go faster and to make it go further.
Were you expecting that there could have been some earlier action? Because the speech from Chris Bishop suggested we're not going to have a report until next year, and he was quite cautious in saying you shouldn't expect anything too soon. So you've been around for a while. There's been several attempts to get a government guarantee up for bonds issued against the community housing sector, because this is very common overseas. And James Palmer, the CEO of Community Finance, made a good point about this on Monday night. So, I understand there's been 2 or 3 attempts to try and get this over the line. Would you have hoped that it was a bit more advanced?
Oh, we're relentlessly positive, Bernard. I mean, I've just come from an enormously successful conference here. I'm talking to you from Auckland, although I live in Wellington. We had 500 delegates. We had nearly 400 people online at the conference. It was our biggest conference ever, most diverse. And we're really going to be relentlessly positive and love these ministers to death, because actually they've said they back our sector. I had a meeting with the Prime Minister. He shook my hand and said, look, we're up for working with the community housing sector. We want to
we'd love
invest
it.
in you.
Yeah.
It's the first time, actually, Peter, that a statement like that has ever been made. That what you said there, Bernard, the minister sort of made a commitment. That's an amazing statement from our perspective, that within 3 or 4 months we're going to see movement on this. So I think really what the minister is signalling is that he wants his officials, wherever they may be in Treasury, in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, to do some work and to make these improvements happen. So we're thrilled with the announcement.
So Paul, one of the things that Bernard and I talk about, partly because I have a family connection to Kaingaora, and I've learnt a lot about Kaingaora. So we've seen Kaingaora sort of gutted like a snapper, or had its wings chopped off by an orca in the middle of Snell's Beach. Can you fill the gap?
That's a big gap, Peter. And
it's very hard to be a stingray without your wings. Yeah.
Yeah. Look.
Sorry, bad metaphor. Go ahead.
No. Look, the minister has clearly signalled, and particularly in his response in the media on Monday, the language he's using is he's agnostic. And I think in a way what he's saying, and I don't want to rephrase for the minister, but I'm going to, what he's really saying is that he wants to see more, lots more, as in quantity and quality of housing delivered. And so I think sometimes I get confused even in my own mind when he's saying he's agnostic about it. At this point, what he's saying is he doesn't mind who delivers, and what the government is saying to us as the community housing sector with our 100 providers from Invercargill to Kaitaia is that he's committed to us playing a part and delivering. And for now, as you know, the challenge that he has set to us as the community providers is to deliver on those 1,500 new social houses that were budgeted for in the budget in May, and those are for the years 26, 27. Our number one priority.
Did you say 1,500?
Confidence. Correct. Yes.
Yeah. How many does Kaingaora have? 70,000.
72,000, and we've got about 26,000.
Yeah.
So, Paul,
So
I'm
they are 4 times larger than we are. So
Yeah.
there's a big difference in scale, Peter, in
Thank
terms
you.
of our
No.
production
I
capacity compared
and I'm
to.
not mean to be mean to you. I just think this because I've seen this before in the UK. We do not have the Roundtree Trust developed from the Peabodys, from the Quakers in the 16th century. We just don't have that scale. And also the other, well, actually, Paul, could you address one question which I find really interesting with Kaigora, and I know it's made many mistakes, but they have an architectural and a sort of planning view about where you put social housing and how you integrate with neighborhoods. How do you guys manage that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it
Sorry,
came up
Bernard.
a hell of a lot over the last 48 hours at the conference.
Good.
And what you're really talking about is the approach that we take is a place-based approach where we're looking at mixed blind tenure. And so we do have a fundamentally different approach in that sense in terms of placemaking, and some great examples. One of the case studies at the conference was a community-led partnership with Te Tumu Kāinga, who are the Māori trustee, with a mixture of community housing providers in partnership with local government, local council, who provided the land. Puhenui in Manukau South, 300 houses, all of equal quality, and a real mixture of social housing paid for by IRRS, rent to own, progressive home ownership, first homeowners, and that's the way we like to roll. So we know that's possible because we've done quite a lot of that as the community housing sector. We're not great fans of large blocks of monotenure, and we will continue to do the very best that we can.
Good,
to
yeah,
deliver
and I don't mean
mixed
to be
tenure
rude to
wherever
you
we
in the
operate.
slightest, Paul, and that I would love to talk to you much more about this because I think it is so interesting how we David Moring, who's one of our regulars, was pointing out that there were many state houses in Herne Bay, and in fact, Steve Brownias, who we all know, lives in what was a state house in a nice street in Herne Bay, and it was built for post office workers. How are we going to have integrated neighborhoods where we live not necessarily next door to millionaires, but we might live next door to a cop or a nurse or anybody doing these jobs that we need? Bernard, I'm sorry, you're getting desperate.
Yeah, no. I'm loving this conversation because it's all about housing. And what struck me this week is that it's great to have a conversation where we're talking about thousands of houses being built by lots of different people. So not just Bangor, not just Fletcher Building, not just Indian homes, but lots of different people. And the other thing that I found really encouraging this week was listening to James Palmer from Community Finance and hearing about the appetite that there is amongst the pension funds community, which, we didn't have this pension fund community 20 years ago. There's $100 billion in KiwiSaver now. There's another $200 billion elsewhere. At the moment, it's going into government bonds in the United States and Europe, when it should be going into houses in Porirua and in Herne Bay, let's say. So I'm curious, what's the scale here? If we can get that government guarantee behind the Community Housing Funding Agency, are we talking thousands of houses that could be funded here by our own savings?
Yes, we really are, Bernard. It was a fascinating moment at our conference when we had the finance panel, and one of the panelists, Roy Thompson, was speaking to the waterfall of cash, that was the language he used, from KiwiSavers. He pointed out that the largest KiwiSaver in the country, I think, was ANZ, and has not much, if any, investment in New Zealand. And I had a conversation with a Danish man who was at the conference, who said it was a jaw-dropping moment for him. He was like, "Oh my God!" In Denmark, similar size in terms of population, they are required, the sovereign wealth funds, the KiwiSaver funds, the super funds are structurally required to invest in local infrastructure. And he said, what a surprise. We've got great hospitals, great roads, great schools, and great housing, because for years we've been investing in our own infrastructure. And he said, what a surprise. It actually pays for itself when you do social housing. Because they were worried at one point of allowing people to come in from overseas to study in their university within Europe, and then they found that if they let them do that, they stayed and they worked, and oh my goodness, they were productive, and it more than paid for itself in terms
Paul,
of social investment.
So I'm going to be applying for a grant soon for you, me, and Bernard, and maybe Patrick Smelly or we might have to take a woman to go to Denmark to study the comparison, because the amazing thing with Denmark, of course, is it doesn't have the oil that Norway does. It's in a reasonably central place in Europe, but it is our population, and they have sorted out, not necessarily to perfection, although of course I'm not sure whether we would have watched 16 episodes of Borgen if it was about the beehive. But there are comparisons here with countries that are not that dissimilar, where we don't relegate people to ghettos. I mean, Sweden has a problem with that, of course, but just to admit
we can
that.
solve this housing crisis. The scale is not so large that it's unsolvable. We have choices as a nation, and some of those date back 30 years. And I'm thrilled to say, I mean, even Portaka's announcement at our conference about the affordable rental housing, hugely helpful, really helpful, because what's being acknowledged there is that it's not just about income-related funded social housing. We also need more affordable rentals, and he really, that was a very, very welcome announcement as well. So I feel like we're pointing in the right direction, but there's so much more we can achieve if we unlock the power of finance and especially the scale of fund managers in New Zealand. There's the possibility that we can actually solve our own problem. Kiwis funding into KiwiSaver, funding into Kiwi housing. Beautiful, beautiful possibility there.
It's a symmetry, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Paul, you've been in the sector for a long, long time. There was a long period when there was hope under the English key government that there would be a lot more action for community housing and help from the government. There was some, but it never really got cracking in a way that maybe some hoped. And then when Labor was in, there was a real focus on Kāinga Ora, pretty much alone.
Yep.
But now the mood is shifting a bit. And we've also got examples to look at of success. Salvation Army through community finance, tens of millions of dollars, the involvement of the likes of Stephen Tyndall, Brendan Lindsay, and Ryan Simpson, with their philanthropic capital behind them. And also Housing Australia. Just briefly, could you tell us about the good story there of Housing Australia, which does have a guarantee and is now going gangbusters?
Yeah, so I brought John Ross, who was at the time the Director of Origination, over to New Zealand and introduced him to Treasury and HUD and our sector in February this year. Unfortunately, he's left. A lovely Kiwi guy from Te Puke, literally writing billions of Australian dollars worth of low-cost, long-term debt into the community housing sector in Australia. And last time I counted, he'd saved the Australian government 750 million Australian dollars in unpaid interest in comparison to what they would have paid in the normal commercial banking system. So a tremendous case study, and we've shared a lot of that policy with the team at HUD who are probably busy right now working up the papers for Minister Bishop that he announced at our conference. So we're really thrilled that there's such a directly comparable good example just across the Tasman. None of this is new. As the guys from the finance panel from Community Finance said at our conference to the delegates on Wednesday, this is not rocket science, it's not new, it's been done successfully in many, many jurisdictions across the world, and it's a solution available to us here. So thrilled about that if that comes off. If it's someone else who gets the guarantee, so be it. But let's get the cost of finance down, because by a factor of 10, it's the largest cost in the delivery and operation of social housing. And so if we can attack that first, then we get more houses per dollar invested. That's a win-win-win in every direction.
Well, it's been wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for coming on a huge week for the sector, maybe a bit of a turning point. And we really... we're cheering you on from the sidelines. Anyone in a warm, dry, affordable house.
Yeah, we'll have you on again. And just actually, Paul, before you go, just because I think we may have messed up the introduction, just tell us exactly what you and your organisation do. Just quick 10
Oh,
seconds.
so I'm the chief executive of a peak body for the registered community housing sector. So we've got members up and down the country. There is a Māori voice for housing called Te Matapihi, also an independent Māori voice. But we've got 160 members across the country, including local governments, but all of the community housing sector. Some are doing IRRS, but a lot do other things: progressive home ownership, city missions, all
What's
the way through the
IRRS?
spectrum. Oh, sorry,
Income-
income-related rent subsidy. So that's
Thank
the
you.
funding for social housing. So,
Thank you.
yeah, sorry, we've got lots of
No,
acronyms
no.
like every
I know.
industry, but
So do we.
we really represent the housing sector, and my job is to face into government and to work and partner with government for better policy and better funding settings, and to try and grow our capability as a sector in terms of our delivery and the work that we do. So, yeah,
Brilliant.
it's a
Thank
real
you very much,
privilege
Paul.
to-
That's really good
yeah,
of
it's a
you,
privilege to
and
do the
our
job.
audience appreciated having you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
We'll have you
Paul.
on again.
Yes.
yes.
Right.
Thanks.
Skateboarding
Oh,
dog,
well, it's
Peter.
a sort of skateboarding dog, because I'm finding myself. Well, I've been talking to some people this week because I think we should do a special, but we'll talk about this. Did you see, Bernard, by the way, that the Hoon has won the Silver Award which I think is pretty amazing, given how ropey it is, and certainly how ropey it was until we got Simon involved. Because Simon's the main. That if we won some Silver Award in the UK New Zealand Podcast Awards, I feel quite proud about that, because it is just a little bit of
Absolutely.
a mission of love by us, and I'm very grateful to our audience. But especially, Simon deserves a huge amount of credit for that. But I'm really horrified by this whole what Elaine Monahan last week, I think 2 weeks ago, maybe called a kekastocracy. And my sort of skateboarding dog is Mrs. Musk, his mum, Elon's Musk
Oh, yeah.
mum, saying today that she's been at Mar-a-Lago with Trump and said his son really respects Donald and they seem to be having fun. Where are we? It's that he's got, first of all, what they call the mainstream media, but I call them the dishonest Democrat media. They will be trying to break up the relationship.
Oh, the relationship. Love it.
Yeah. But I got this from the Hindustan Times, which inserted a quote, what was allegedly a quote, in the headline, which I cannot find anywhere, so I don't believe it exists. But the headline described them as toddlers on a play date, Musk and Trump, which seemed pretty good to me.
Yeah, with the world at stake.
Bernard, so you're going to make your plane?
I am going to make my plane. Thank you so much for being patient and amazed at work. Thank you.
And the audience.
And thank you to Simon.
And Robert.
And Robert. And we're thrilled to be the Silver Award winning podcast on current affairs in the country.
Well, I think any more would be greedy. Now, Bernard, do I have to make up your bed?
No, we'll get there. We'll get there.
All right. Anybody else who wants
everyone.
to make up a bed for them, I'm very happy to. Call me. See you.
Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.